Hey, good morning. I'm Bob Ames, and I'm the director of the Kelvin Center for Innovation in Business and also Associate Dean of the School of Business here at Kelvin University. And it's just my pleasure to welcome all of you this morning to our Kelvin University Executive Breakfast Series presentation on the future of sports, featuring Dr. Brian Bolt of Kelvin University and Dr. Chad Carlson from Hope College. Like most sporting events of the past 12 months, this presentation has been delayed and rescheduled a few times, but we never give up. And we're happy to finally be having this conversation virtually with our esteemed guests and most importantly with all of you. As is our custom at Kelvin, let me begin our presentation this morning with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask that our time together this morning may be blessed with the presence of your Holy Spirit as we gather virtually to learn about and discuss the future of sports. We pray that you will help us to think of sports in ways that celebrate you, especially your creation of athletes with all different kinds of abilities and endeavors who inspire us and entertain us with all of their amazing feats. May we enjoy sports and athletes as good gifts from you and always give our thanks to you for them in the name of Jesus. Amen. So before we begin our presentation this morning, I have just a couple of quick announcements for you. First, our next executive breakfast event will be next fall in September of 2021. And we're planning more great sessions for you on the future of everything. We're even hopeful that we might be able to gather and actually have a breakfast when we do our next presentation. But we're also continuing to explore the option of providing the content virtually to make it available to a much larger audience. So stay tuned for details on that. If you're interested in learning more about our new online Kelvin MBA, and who isn't, right? It's going to be launching in the fall of 2021, and we've got a virtual event coming up on March 24th at noon. We're doing it at noon so that it plays well on the West Coast as well as on the East Coast. It'll be a 30-minute live forum featuring our MBA program director, Marilyn Stansberry, and she'll be taking questions and sharing information with you on this exciting program. If you're interested, contact us at business@kelvin.edu, and we'll give you more information on how to register. And by the way, it's free. So we hope if you're interested that you'll be joining us on March 24th for that. I'm going to jump right in. We were going to have Nancy Meyer. Oh, Nancy, you're here. Awesome. All right. I'm going to introduce you to Nancy Meyer. Nancy is going to be introducing our speakers today and moderating our conversation. The reason I'm a little kind of halting here is she was having a hard time logging on, and so I'm so happy to see her face. Nancy Meyer is professor of kinesiology at Kelvin University, and she's also our senior associate athletic director. Nancy has also got a long history in athletics with many experiences as an outstanding coach in several different sports at Kelvin, including being recognized in multiple sports as an outstanding coach and being twice named cross-country national coach of the year in NCAA Division III. So I want to welcome Nancy Meyer and thank her for her diligence in getting on this morning. So Nancy, take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the delay. Somehow Skype was not happy with my Mac, so found a way around it, and here we go. I don't want to take any of Chad and Brian's time away, so I'll make this brief. I'm excited to introduce them. Should be a really fun half hour of conversation. Dr. Bolt is a proud 1990 graduate of Kelvin University. He went on to receive his doctoral degree from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. He was a member of our department here in kinesiology, and I think he still holds that title of professor, but he currently serves as the Dean of Education. In addition, he is very involved in sport here at Kelvin. He's our men's golf coach, and he's been a sport fan his whole life. In fact, he wrote a book recently, Sport, Faith, and Life, which is a book offering sort of a theological perspective on the world of sport. And along joining Brian is Dr. Carlson. Chad is a 203, just a youngster, a graduate of Hope College, and he received his doctoral program from Penn State. He's a sports philosopher by training, and he's currently an associate professor at Hope. And he is in charge in their kinesiology department, I should add, and he's their director of general education. In addition to being involved with sport himself as an athlete, he wrote the book Making March Madness, the early years of the NCAA, NIT, and college basketball championship tournaments. A historical look, 1922 to 1951. And it's really interesting that these two men have been able to bridge the divide of the Hope Kelvin rivalry, and they have done some really fun collaborations. So welcome to both of you. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Bob. Both of you, very generous thoughts, and we're excited to be here. Nice to be invited to this program. We have, like Bob said, been trying to give this presentation for a while, and obviously it has changed many, many times in this pandemic. We're going to talk a little bit about the future of sports, but really we can't predict the future any better than anyone else can. We can look at trends and see how things go. It is fun to hear stories from people like you, to see the things that you see, and everyone is living a different life as it applies to sport. And so we're hoping to be able to get to your questions as well. I encourage you to put questions in the chat, and at the end, we'll be able to respond to as many of those as we can. So a lot of ground to cover. We'll move quickly. Let's kind of take it from here. So the first thing I want to do is just give you some sense of how two guys from rival colleges ended up working together. Both Chad and I were interested, as you could tell from just some of our introduction, that we wrote and thought about sport and Christianity. And a friend of ours, Nick Watson, kind of organized this big conference in England, first inaugural global congress on sport and Christianity. And I was invited to speak there, and Chad as well. And we decided, we're just down the road. Let's collaborate on something. And the only thing we could really come up with was writing a paper about rivalry. And so that's how it started. We decided that the Hope Kelvin rivalry was worth digging into, and we delivered that paper in England, and then it grew from there. Nick Watson said, "Hey, why don't you do this at Kelvin next?" And so I quickly got on the phone with Chad, and we then launched the second Global Congress on Sport and Christianity, which we held here at Kelvin University. And it was one of the last big events before COVID shut everything down. It was an exciting event. We had speakers from all over the world, almost a dozen keynotes, obviously the most famous being Tim Tebow, who came and spoke and filled the arena, and also came to our chapel and gave us kind of an hour of Q&A, which was really kind of an exciting event. That event just exceeded our expectations. So we are now involved with a third Global Congress, which will be back in England, and we're not doing that virtually. So no matter what happens, I'm getting to Cambridge, and we want to be excited to gather that group of people, and that organization just continues to grow. And essentially, it's practitioners and academics speaking together about this whole intersection of sport and faith. Just the elephant in the room quickly about COVID. I think it's obvious that this world has changed, and sport has been affected as well. Everyone now has a story, and for those involved in sport, it includes how that worked out in the pandemic for you. And for all of us, it's sort of, we have this idea of something being canceled, something lost for sure. It might be something that we watched, something we participated in. Maybe we watched our teenagers or our young kids not be able to participate in sport. So it taught us some new things about this pandemic or about sport in this pandemic. Interesting that, usually before this, people would talk about sport as being too powerful and kind of preeminent and taking over people's lives. What's interesting in the pandemic, it did move from necessity, what seemed like a necessity, to a luxury. It was canceled quickly. And even very big events, big revenue generating events were canceled quickly. Obviously, modification, Nancy knows for sure that all of Kelvin's coaches right now are spending much of their day testing athletes. We go and set up the tables and test athletes. It's a big change in the way that we do things, and there's been a great deal of fallout. Obviously, the financial fallout from all these big events and all these schools attempting to run sport or losing revenue in a number of ways. Structures have changed. Some sports have really adjusted. Some have elevated, and we'll talk a bit about that. And interest has changed. It'll be interesting coming out of this, what we see in terms of where people's allegiances have fallen, how patterns have changed, and how habits that people have been doing things for years and years. Does sport have the sticking power to bring people back? And that'll be a good question. And a big theme today is proportionality. I mean, we know economically that some people have lost a lot of money during this and other people have thrived during the pandemic. Proportionality is a big deal. When something like a pandemic comes along, it exposes things maybe that we weren't thinking about before. I like the way Warren Buffett puts it. He said, only when the tide goes out do you discover who's been swimming naked. And in some ways, this pandemic has exposed some things in sport, too, that we maybe wouldn't have seen or didn't care to look at. So we're going to walk through these sorts of things today really quickly. First, we're going to say that as academics, we're always going to say there's really nothing new under the sun. We're going to go look back at history to show you that sport has, in all of its evolution, has not changed all that much. We'll hit the topic of athlete activism and fan experience, youth, and we'll talk a little bit about a sign of the apocalypse. Of course, we're going to talk about Calvin Hope, and then we're going to end with sport, faith, life. So there's play and activity and sport-like activities in multiple civilizations in the past, but the ones that are most famous, obviously, are the Greek games, the ancient games of Olympia and nearby locations. And what's really shocking is how these games that were organized over 3,000 years ago bears such a resemblance to what we have going on today, and that gives us a hint into what might continue. I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of some of the things that are still the same. Super Bowl halftime shows really epitomize the pomp and circumstance of sport. Sport attracts people, and we take advantage of that attraction. Everyone tries to link something to sport. Many things happen around sport that really have nothing to do with the actual game, like halftime shows, flyovers, or even things like Christian testimonials. In Greece, the games were giant festivals for the gods. Everyone would come, and everyone that could be there, every free person, was there. Wars were halted, roads were paved, areas were cleared for merchants, politicians came and pressed the flesh. And along with the games, there were parades, there was drama, there were heralding competitions, religious sacrifices. Just like today, it was a really big show. We often talk about the games as being a bit more pure because the prize wasn't so much, we think, money, but it was this crown of olives or this crown of celery. Either one of those were used in various games. But the truth is that's not accurate at all. In fact, if you won an Olympic competition, you were rich. When you went back to your city-state, first of all, your taxes were gone. You did not have to pay taxes anymore. You probably ate on the state for the rest of your life. You were a hero. Athletes would also have kind of like contracts with their city-state, kind of making them as rich as Blake Griffin or Miguel Cabrera. They would receive large vats of olive oil, which would essentially be turned into cash, the ability to purchase. And And that statue there, ironically, of course, is the statue of the goddess Nike, the goddess of victory. And they would actually have sponsors. Just like today, people would pay money so that they could quit their jobs and train for their sport. Much the same as today, money is deeply involved in sport. Cheating. We know for sure that we have famous or infamous cheaters. I'm highlighting here Lance Armstrong. But it was also true that people were trying to get away with things back then. In fact, these statues or these bases that you see entering the stadium are called zanes. And if you were caught cheating, you had to pay for a sculpture to be created that showed your misdeeds. And that sculpture would sit at this entryway so that all the athletes could come in and see what would happen if you were caught cheating. A few more, body sculpting. The glorification of the human body back then, and we're very much in that space right now. Really, enough said on that one. And then finally, this urinal was signed by Barry Sanders. Apparently, he used it for about 10 years as a member of the Lions, and a fan paid $5,000 for it. Sadly, I was outbid. I wanted that in my house, but I failed. Greek athletes, interestingly, obviously they competed in the nude and covered their bodies with oil, with olive oil, and then this dust covering on top of that, and then worked out and may have, sweat and blood and all of that stuff. But at the end of the games, they would take this object called a strigil, and it had a metal end to it, and you would scrape all that goo and guck off your body, put it in a jar, and sell it. That would be for medicinal purposes, but no, that paraphernalia or memorabilia was a part of sport even back then. The Greeks knew the popularity of sport. They leveraged it. Even Alexander the Great was said to control certain parts of society. Entertainment and sport were part of that. Also, education and healthcare. If you want to affect people, affect culture, get people falling in line, controlling those entities served a lot for political purposes. And so as we look to the future, I guarantee we will continue to see people leveraging sport for their own purposes. Sometimes we love it, and sometimes we don't.
Thanks, Brian. One of those purposes is athlete activism. One of the most prominent parts of sport over the past 12 months has been the rise of athlete activism. And by this, I mean athletes speaking out on controversial social and political issues. The changes in our lives due to COVID escalated the prominence of athlete activism, increasing a change that had been occurring over the last 2 decades. Historically, elite athletes have been conformists. In order to make the team or learn the skills or work through the system, an athlete has to conform to behavioral expectations from each coach and each organization. When we think about our hero athletes, this is often an under-recognized facet of the sport machine. It produces conformity. If you want to play for this team, or if you want to win, you'll do as I say. Muhammad Ali has such a large presence in sport history because he did not conform. He spoke out about the injustices he experienced. He thought for himself on social issues and shared his views publicly. I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong, he said, claiming conscientious objector status to avoid the draft. He is the historical exception, or at least one of them, when it comes to athlete activism. Michael Jordan is more the rule. What did Air Jordan stand for besides Nike, Gatorade, McDonald's, and Hanes? What were his political views? When asked in the early 1990s to publicly support a black Democratic candidate for U.S. Congress from his home state of North Carolina, who was running against a white Republican incumbent who had supported Jim Crow laws beyond the 1960s, Jordan said no. When asked why, he responded, "Republicans buy Nikes too." This is a classic line depicting how athletes conformed to authority, a result of years spent within the authoritarian machinery of organized sport. The age of Muhammad Ali or Michael Jordan is past. Athletes are not expected to conform as they once were, and athletes who speak out are no longer ostracized. Today, elite athletes have greater power. They make far more money than athletes in the past. Kansas City Chiefs quarterback Patrick Mahomes last year signed a contract that will earn him $500 million over 10 years. That gives him a lot of power. Athletes of today also have a larger platform to share their views, just like everyone else in the world, through social media. Soccer star Cristiano Ronaldo has more than 90 million Twitter followers. That means that anytime he has a thought on anything and posts it to Twitter, it shows up on more phones than there are people in all of Germany. So what are we to make of the increasing levels of athlete activism? Pro sports owners traditionally haven't liked athletes speaking out on social or political issues. And neither have fans. They've wanted their sports to be diversions from the real issues in the world. That day and age is long gone. When LeBron James was told 3 years ago by a media pundit that he should just shut up and dribble instead of speaking out on social issues, there was severe backlash to that comment. That represents a suppression-based conformist culture that is no longer in vogue. Athletes are speaking out on social and cultural issues more than they ever have. During the 2020 NBA season, we even saw an entire team, the Milwaukee Bucks, protest by sitting out of a playoff game. How did the NBA respond? The league postponed all 3 playoff games for that day. There was no punishment, and the Bucks didn't even have to suffer a loss from forfeiture. What will the future look like for this? We're going to see a lot more athlete activism. We're going to see the further blurring of lines between the previously separable entertainment, sports, and political industries. Will LeBron James ever become president of the United States? I'm not so sure about that. But he is part owner of Liverpool, one of the top soccer clubs in the world, and his digital media company produces shows for the likes of HBO. His influence extends well beyond sport. Rapper Jay-Z at one point owned a small share of the NBA's Brooklyn Nets. He now owns Rock Nation, an entertainment company that represents many star athletes. And the Milwaukee Bucks team that just sat out of a playoff game last year for political protest, their executive vice president just announced he's running for Congress in 2022. Overlap among the sport, entertainment, and political spheres is not new, but the overlap is growing, and athletes are playing a larger role. No longer are they content to just shut up and dribble. They stand up or kneel down like Colin Kaepernick for what they believe. Plenty more have now shown that they're willing to follow. Pro athletes have more money, more voice, and more power than they ever have. Let's hope that more athletes in the future will follow the lead of LeBron James, who's given millions of dollars to start schools and youth programming, or all-pro defensive end J.J. Watt, who raised more than $41 million for Hurricane Harvey relief funds, or even, finally, Michael Jordan, who's pledged more than $100 million to organizations fighting racism. Athlete activism is at an all-time high. So is athlete philanthropy. Both of these trends, in my best guess, will continue to grow. So how about the fan experience? Let's look at some implications of gambling in fantasy sport. Americans have had an ambivalent relationship with gambling, especially that connected to sport. Federal legislation in 2018 has left it up to each state whether it wants to allow sports gambling or not. This is a major change. Daily fantasy sport and sport gambling websites like DraftKings and FanDuel have proliferated in many of the 24 states that now allow sports betting. And there are 14 more states that could allow it by the end of 2022. So a likely prediction? I think many more states will allow it. Sports gambling is a large and growing industry. And in the states where it wasn't legal before 2018, it's a novel approach to the fan experience that many sports spectators are trying out. FanDuel and DraftKings are basically offering free money in the form of vouchers to draw in potential customers. You can bet $5 on Michigan men's basketball team beating Northwestern, for example, and win $500 in vouchers, for instance. That's almost a guarantee win. One of the most recent advances in the sport gambling industry is the ability to do in-game betting. Now, the odds will change between each play during the actual game, and a fan could bet on the game's outcome at any point. For fans of particular teams who spend a lot of time watching and getting a feel for their teams, this represents an opportunity to capitalize. And I'm thinking specifically of Detroit Lions fans. After experiencing the heartbreak of watching the Lions snatch defeat from the jaws of victory time and again, Lions fans like Brian should consider betting on the Lions. They can get good in-game odds when the Lions are ahead, because as every Lion fan knows, they will inevitably lose. Might as well make some money in the midst of that weekly disappointment. I've referred to fantasy sports and gambling as parasitic games. They latch onto sports as ways to make sports more interesting. But in doing so, they change the culture. Instead of just watching to see who wins or loses, you now watch to see how the players on your team are doing statistically, or you watch to see whether the team you pick to win covers the spread or not. All of this changes the purity of the experience from a sport perspective. Purist fans love to watch to see how the drama unfolds. How does the pitcher alter his strategy the third time he faces the slugger who got a hit both of his first two at-bats? How will the quarterback attack the defense late in the game that's been blitzing heavily on third downs? These are the dramas that sports fans have traditionally savored. They require a certain level of knowledge of the game that takes time to develop. Not all fans get to this level or are interested in getting to this level. Fantasy sport and sports gambling now make it easier to watch at a surface level, and they give more reason to do so. What will the future look like? Sports gambling will continue to grow. That's inevitable. Pro soccer stadiums in Europe have for years had gambling vestibules within their stadiums. With gambling apps on phones now, that isn't necessary. I wonder how long it will be before a season ticket holder in the front row of an NBA stadium can see what play a coach draws up in a late game timeout and make a bet instantly based on that information. And what would keep an NBA assistant from offering insider information to a courtside fan during a game in exchange for a fraction of the money that the fan stands to win from betting? Look at how close in this picture the fans are to the coaches and the players. What I'm most interested in for the future, how will the economics of this play out? We've had gambling and point-shaving scandals in sport, but not recently at the pro levels. In pro sport, the athletes usually make enough money in salary that it isn't worth their while to risk their reputations to collude with gamblers for more money. But in college sport, the risk is real. Most gambling scandals in sport have occurred at the college level. College athletes are not paid, and gamblers have gotten to them by saying, your team is supposed to win. For example, I don't need you to lose the game. I just need you to make a couple mistakes late so that your team doesn't win by as much as they're supposed to. Basketball is particularly susceptible to this because of the way one player can impact a game. A gambler could give a couple $1,000s to any college basketball player, and that kid could be much richer by complying with a gambler's wishes to miss a few extra shots, throw a few passes away, and still fly under the radar. I think that with the increased availability of sports gambling, the possibility of this happening has gone up. College basketball just barely weathered widespread gambling scandals in 1951 and 1961. The economics have changed since then. There's widespread conversation about allowing athletes to profit financially while in college. This would actually reduce the incentives for a college athlete to take a bribe to throw a game or shave points. And so I think the era of paying college athletes is very near, and the legalization of sports gambling will hasten its imminence.
Jed, you really don't get it. A true Lions fan will never bet against the Lions, and I'm sorry. Even though if I can make money, and Nancy knows I'm not allowed to bet anyway. So let's. Few of us are involved directly in professional sport or even Division I high-end college sport. But we're not going to talk about something that does hit home more often, and that is just what happens in our families or what we see on the ball fields around us, and that's youth sport. And we're going to focus, because we're in the U.S. here, we're going to focus on things that have been happening in the United States. Some of this extrapolates to other countries, but the U.S. is also quite unique in the way that it views sport, the way that it does sport. And so we'll put our focus there for a little while. First, just a little bit of the scope. Youth participation in sport is at about 10 million. These are 2019 numbers. That actually, the arrow is going down. It's interesting that participation in sport is actually dropping. There's odd trends. We can compare this at 38% of the eligible youth are now participating in sport, but a decade ago, 45% of eligible youth. And usually when you see youth sport statistics, it will be from the age of 6 to 12. I know that both ends of those get pushed a little bit, but that's essentially where those statistics are. Also compare it to Europe. 70% of eligible youth in Europe participate in youth sport, which is just an interesting, entirely different model in the way that sport is done in other places. Some different numbers as well to try to help us get a grasp of this. First of all, it's a big business. Sorry, my slide's not going. There we go. It's a $19 billion industry for youth sport. And just to compare that, we are struggling. There we go. 15 billion it comes in through the NFL. And so you can understand that there is money to be spent on youth sport. And it's been very interesting, obviously, during the pandemic. A number of different outlets have found ways to thrive during the pandemic when we talk about youth sport. But all of that 19 billion, most of it comes from you. So you out there are paying for this. You are the families that is pumping money into youth sport. Less than a quarter of it goes to schools, and that gets diffused in a number of different ways because sports are subsidized in different ways during schools. So most of this comes from private clubs. Private clubs have been on the increase, and if you you've had kids in the sport world, you recognize the sort of prominence of private clubs. My son played on a club baseball team for which I paid $250, and we were playing against a team, and we walked over and talked to the parents on the other team. They fly all over the United States to play. That was a $23,000 buy-in. Those are the extremes. $250 is extremely low, and $23,000 is extremely high. But $6,000 to $10,000 is not unusual when you talk about participation in club sports in a variety of different clubs. Down, of course, going with that are the publicly funded programs, and this is one of the great, truthfully, tragedies of what has happened to sport. We have seen that participation really is correlated very directly with family income. And so when you see numbers dropping, very often it is lower income people that are unable to get access to participate in sports. In fact, this is becoming so prevalent that a lot of charity organizations are working to try to bring it back. It'll be interesting to see if publicly funded programs or other entities fill the gap for students or kids that would not normally be able to buy into the club system. The most popular sports in the United States for kids, and if you combine boys and girls on this, the most popular sport, not by a huge margin, is basketball. The next popular sport is the combination of baseball and softball, and then soccer is third. You might think otherwise, but that is what we're seeing in the total trends. And really the next one, not on the slide, is sort of interesting. It's football, but not the football you would imagine. It's actually flag football. Flag football has really increased in popularity in the last few years. Fifth is football itself. So these numbers are changing, and some are, as we look at the trends, changing a lot faster than others. Some other quick trends, and I'll just kind of talk through these as we go. The first one is this. Just about girls themselves, you see that it's not quite half. About 43% of those participants are girls. And I told you those numbers are going down. They're actually going down slower than the boys, so they are maintaining interest in sport. It may have to do with the next trend that we'll see in a second. The girls are participating more often in what were considered boys' sports. Football, wrestling, and baseball. Actually, there's increases in girl participation in all of those. Football itself is an interesting thing. Obviously, we're hearing less about it in the news now, but if you just think a few years back, football has dropped by over 1 million participants since 2008. And flag football is up. Most analysts will attribute that to conversations about concussions affecting the trends for people putting their kids into contact football. Another trend that we saw for a while was that rugby and ice hockey were thriving. Ice hockey still is, but rugby, because of the concussions, has slowed just like all of the others. Just a few issues to highlight that will continue to be issues and play out in the future. Things that need to be sorted out by those that are organizing youth sport. The first one is this idea of club versus high school. We're seeing this play out in a number of different ways. Obviously, we talked about the haves and the have-nots, those with access and those that don't. And certain sports don't lend themselves. For example, football doesn't lend itself as much to the club scene. And this unique American system. It's one of the few places where schools and sports are connected. In fact, they're so strongly tied. Obviously, at the collegiate level, people have just unbelievable allegiances to the sport and the university. The same is true in high schools, but that is starting to fracture for sure as good athletes are making decisions. Do I play in my club season or do I play in my school season? That will continue to put pressure on this system. The public versus private, certainly at the high school level, this has flared up in just about every state where private schools tend to take home a disproportionate share of state titles. And that's just one metric that you can use to try to figure out fairness or parity. And so that's a difficult problem to deal with, and states are trying to deal with that in a number of ways by classifying private schools in different ways, and that will likely continue. You can see that even in the world of athlete portals and so on, this whole idea of movement has made its way into the collegiate program, but also into the high school program as people find their way to play sports in the places where they want to play. The last issue is access, and all you have to do is turn on the news and you will get a heavy dose of this issue as well. So this access issue is going to be a major part of our future, our near future, and certainly extended out, the transgender access. Lots of bills being proposed, debated at the national and at the state level around this issue. So I know it's not a new thing, but this idea of esports is only going to grow. The unbelievable amount of attention to esports, and we can debate whether or not esports are sports, but we can't debate whether or not they are making an impact in the traditional world of sport. Just a few numbers on esports. There are 50 million consumers worldwide, and they can hardly keep up with the number. It's growing at such a high percentage that everybody wants a piece of this. By 2022, the projected revenue is 1.8 billion, and this is global. The United States is certainly heavily invested, but Asian markets, all sorts of different entities around the world are getting into esports in lots of different ways, and it can connect kids from all around the world in this really interesting and unique way when you think about how it works, the communities and the networks that it builds. 200 colleges in the United States have now added esports as a sport, as a club. And that is growing, and they're just very quickly trying to catch up with one another. 17 states have added it to their list of sports. And obviously, Christian colleges are seeing this as well as a place to add. And so all sorts of ethical issues and difficulties as you think about how esports fit with traditional sports. And even the platforms and games that are used come into question as we think about esports. So it's a really interesting thing to follow. This intersection here that you see between esports and traditional sports, some people are even trying to fill that. They think that there is a space for a combination of physical skill or physical movement kind of sport going with the traditional esports. And so what we'll see there is I anticipate that both Kelvin and Hope will have esports before too long. I know that sounds crazy, but right now there's an esports club at Alma College, and every time we go to Trine University, as the golf coach, I'll walk into the the clubhouse, and just behind the clubhouse is the esports training room. And they look a lot like Chad there with his headphones and doing finger exercises to get yourself nimble. Chad, up to you.
I had a student a few years ago, a Hope College student athlete in one of my classes, that told me in the off season of his traditional sport, he was training 10 hours a day to try to become an elite esports athlete. I was amazed and appalled at the same time. That's becoming more and more common. Hey, let me provide two thoughts about the future of Kelvin and Hope. I think these things might hit close to home for you like they do for me. First, this past week, both the Hope and Kelvin men's basketball teams lost in the MIAA tournament semifinals. This marked the third straight season when neither Hope nor Kelvin has won the league or the league tournament. When is the last time that 3 consecutive MIAA men's basketball seasons concluded without Hope or Kelvin on top? It hasn't happened since before Kelvin joined the conference in 1953. That's 70 years. This is an unprecedented lack of success for the rivalry, not for either school itself, but for the rivalry. What's my prediction? It's going to be very difficult for Kelvin and Hope to get back to the historical patterns of Hope or Kelvin winning every year. Both schools have traditionally won without selling their souls to the altar of college sport. Both schools continue to follow healthy models. Other MIAA schools have begun putting more resources into winning athletic teams, into having winning athletic teams, especially in men's basketball. This will make it more difficult for Kelvin and Hope to have the kind of success over other league schools that we've enjoyed in the past. It was never easy, but it will be harder now than ever. Do I think Hope and Kelvin will ever be on top again? Yes, of course I do, and I wish for that. I hope it happens sooner than later, but it won't come without great efforts from both schools. And that's what it takes, an entire institution's effort for that kind of success. Second, will Kelvin ever field a football team? I'm not in on conversations on campus, so I can't speak from the inside. This is a picture of a guy that we recruited at Hope, but he wanted to go to Kelvin for football. Brian can speak to this, but I know the landscape. Kelvin football takes up a lot of campus, college football takes up a lot of campus resources. It's expensive, but it provides massive benefits to small colleges' admissions office, among other things. Many Division III colleges require the football program to bring in a certain number of first-year students into its program each year, 50, 80, or even 100 to play football. These small schools that are much like Hope and Kelvin usually have more female students than males, and football helps offset that imbalance, and it drives up enrollment. Other benefits to having a football program? Well, honestly, they're pretty negligible. And at a place like Kelvin that usually has at least 2 national title contending teams each fall, there isn't a need for the entertainment that a football program would provide. I don't know what the future holds, but I'll tell you my thoughts. From a competitive standpoint, I hope Kelvin starts a football program. That would, in my opinion, be better for Hope College. The sports at Hope that are our best have traditionally been the ones in which Kelvin is also good. Hope sports teams do better overall when they have a strong rival in Kelvin. That seems to push our programs to do well, and it helps us encourage student athletes to come to our programs. Having a Kelvin-Hope football rivalry would further incentivize so many high school players from the region to want to come play football for one of the 2 schools, escalating our level of play. And yet I also kind of like that Kelvin has withstood the many social forces that would lead towards having a football team. There's something endearing about that. Kelvin has said, we're not going to be like other schools. I like that. I think it speaks to a healthy set of priorities for the future. Of course, what Brian tells me is that Kelvin won't ever have football because they don't think they could ever beat Hope. And I guess I understand that too. That might be one of the best predictions for the future of sports.
Still undefeated, Chad. We have fought the good fight for football over here. Maybe it will resurface at one point, but for now, you go ahead and bang your heads together over there. That seems to be a good thing at Hope. Chad and I, after our second Global Congress collaboration, decided that we weren't done and we wanted to spend a bit more time making sure that all the issues that we've surfaced here today are include a Christian voice, and for us, ultimately, kind of a Reformed Christian voice. And so what we have done is recently launch what we call Sport Faith Life. And you can find that at sportfaithlife.com. This is a portal much like the Global Congress, where what we try to do is hit issues that affect people's lives and look at them at this intersection between sport and faith. Often academics only talk to themselves, practitioners only talk to themselves, sports ministry people only talk to themselves. And so what we try to do is bring all those folks together in a room and really unpack some of these issues. And so we would love to have you take a look at Sport Faith Life at sportfaithlife.com. What we do is we release a podcast every couple of weeks. Tomorrow we'll release our 38th podcast. And when we do that, most of the time what we're doing is finding people more entertaining than us and interviewing them. People that are doing sport and faith around the world. When the podcast is released, we also release a blog at the same time. And so you can read about it, you can hear about it, and you can go back and listen to some of our episodes where we do walk through the current and contemporary issues and try to put our perspective into the mix as people talk about how sport is evolving and moving into the future. You can also find us here at these socials, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. It gives us an opportunity to reach out to a variety of groups, and it's been fun. It really gives us an opportunity to try to connect people around the world. Our last interview was from a gentleman in Brazil, and he's doing really good work down there in sport and faith, and it's just encouraging to see people doing that around the world. We are to the end of our presentation, and so I want to thank all of you for listening. And we'd love to hear any questions from any of you.
Do I have the mic?
I think you do.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chad and Brian. That was extremely interesting. I would love to have interrupted you multiple times and asked questions on particular topics, but that wasn't my role. So I do have some questions for you. Some have been sent in and some we thought of. And I'd like to go back to the very beginning, Brian, where you did a very nice analysis of 2020 and how the pandemic has interrupted all of life, including sports. But one person posed the question, can you think of some positive ways in which the pandemic has impacted sport? And you could pick any level.
Sure. I actually taught a course in the summer, sport and play in the time of a pandemic. And I'll just hit a couple of highlights. And what I did is I spent time having people think about some of the losses in their lives. And ESPN made this famous as well, even writing letters back to their sport and thinking about how it had played a particular role in their life. And I really found people really reflecting on the positives of those sport experiences in that time. The other thing that I would say really developed, and I have been beating this drum long before the pandemic, is just the organized nature of sport and the stress that goes along with sport, especially for kids. And it's been surprising, I think, for a lot of families how play has sort of reemerged, and that self-organized play that is spontaneous, that is an opportunity for students to be creative, to sort out their own problems, not be directed by adults. And youth sport has become so adult directed. People make that argument about soccer, for instance, in the United States. Why can soccer not just gain any ground at the world stage? And one of the explanations is that just the lack of creativity and play. We've organized it down to the very end, and And because of that, they just don't have the ability to do what is necessary at the highest levels. And so I would say that the emergence of play and just the reflection on the positive aspects of sport have really struck me during this time.
Okay. Chad, any thoughts, or should we move on?
I was going to say the same thing. I have a young family, and my kids and I, instead of spending every evening shipping them to basketball practice, baseball practice, volleyball practice, we spent time in the basement just playing, coming up with their own games. And that was a lot of fun. I know a lot of other families had similar experiences.
Great. Thanks. So as we reflect on the role of women in sport, it has been influential, but not hugely significant historically. Men still dominate the leadership roles at all levels, whether it's coaching or administration. There's huge salary differences on the professional levels. Can you kind of cast your eyes forward in the next decade and speculate how the role of women in sport at multiple levels will change and hopefully improve?
So one of the things that we're seeing right now that's occurred over the last 12 months is the emergence of females in executive roles in professional sports that they have not held in the past. And I'm thinking of the NFL, Major League Baseball, and the NBA have all seen a rise in female leadership. I assume this will continue. This seems to be a trend that has been positive. In fact, Super Bowl winning Tampa Bay Buccaneers had a female assistant coach on their sideline, and they were a new team to do something like that. We see, I believe it is the Marlins who hired the first female lead executive of their program. So we're seeing more females in leadership roles in professional sports. Unfortunately, we're not seeing an uptick in the amount of female sports on television. We're actually seeing a downward trend there since, I believe, the late 1990s. I remember being a part of a conversation when I was a grad student at Penn State with all the coaches at Penn State, in which the presentation to the coaches was, we're going to start a new Big Ten network. That's obviously something that's existed now for more than a decade. But when that was starting, the way in which the president sold that to the school was to say, hey, look, for all of you programs where you're getting kids from all over the country, specifically our non-revenue generating programs, we're going to put all of your events on the Big Ten network so your families and the families of the athletes can watch these. What's happened is the Big Ten network and the other college sports conference networks haven't. In fact, they've kowtowed to football and basketball instead of showing programming of non-revenue generating and female sports that they had promised at the outset.
Interesting. I think volleyball might be an exception there, but yeah, that's very interesting.
Another trend that was interesting in the pandemic, almost all professional sports, even though we thought that everyone was just dying to see professional sports, almost all of them took a hit in terms of rating, a significant hit. Lots of different nations and people are wringing their hands trying to figure that out. The WNBA actually went in the opposite direction. So the amount of interest and the amount of actual ratings actually increased in that one area. I don't know what that says at this point, because it could just be a blip or it could just be seasons overlapping in different ways, but it was interesting and something to watch.
One more thought on that particular topic. Chad, you addressed the Kelvin Hope rivalry and its future. Why is it always tied to men's basketball? You look at your own program of women's basketball and the success they've had, and certainly we've had at Kelvin a lot of success on our women's side, although not currently. Why are we so tied to men's basketball? When you talk to the athletes, they don't see it that way, but I know the alums do.
Yeah, men's basketball has traditionally been the face of the rivalry. And I think that sort of reaffirms the fact that sports are male-dominated, male-identified, and male-centered historically. And so we talk about the Hope Kelvin basketball rivalry, and what we mean is the men's basketball rivalry. But then when we're referring to the women's, we use the term women's. And we see that in sport across the board. We have the NBA and the WNBA. It's not the MNBA, the Men's National Basketball Association, and the women's. It's the NBA and the WNBA. And so we oftentimes identify sport as male in that way. And so I'm not sure that we've seen much of a change in that trend. There are market forces that are pushing back against that, but it seems like we should be getting to the point now, because we're so far beyond Title IX at this point in time, that we should be able to identify sport with the gender, as opposed to men who play the sport and women who play the women's sport.
Right.
It's probably a broader answer than what you were looking for, but I do think Hope and
No.
Kelvin affirm some of those trends by the way that we talk about the rivalry.
Right. Another question: do you think the growth in athlete activism is good for sport?
Well, there's probably a number of different ways of looking at that. There is a prominent social justice proponent it's the Martin Luther King Jr. of the Caribbean, and his name is CLR James, who's a big cricket fan. And he often asks the question, what do they know of cricket who only cricket know? And I think we can extrapolate on that to talk about sport. What do they know of sport who only sport know? So when athletes are talking about social issues, I think it speaks to the fact that they have interests beyond their sport. And I think that's a healthy thing. I don't think we want our athletes to be robots or too mechanical in that all they know is sport. If all they know is sport, they don't really understand the true essence of sport. And yet, I think there are times when the lines blur a little bit in ways that are unhealthy, or when athletes are taking stands on controversial issues. Sometimes that takes away from what Brian's done a really nice job of promoting, and that is the playful element of sport. Sport becomes a job. It becomes political. It becomes something else than what it was at its essence, and that is play. So I can see good and bad coming out of all this, and I think there's good reasons to be able to say there's good and bad that comes out of all this.
Yeah, and I would just add that the meaning of the word sport, where it originates, ultimately goes to carry away, and there is an element of sport where it carries us away. And I think people get frustrated at times, no matter what side is doing it. It's interesting, depending on the message, it either affirms what you think or the opposite. And we tend to not be very critical when it affirms what we think. And I think this idea of sport being a place to be carried away can get lost when, going back to my first point, when it's just leveraged over and over again by every organizational group. And whether that be social justice or patriotism, that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. I believe Bob Ames has a question. Michael, can he be brought into this conversation?
All right. Chad, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
All right, I'll ask my question. By the way, thanks to both of you. I know we're bumping up on our end time here too, so I'll probably just ask this question and then we'll close. But before I ask my question, I want to thank Nancy Meyer for joining us as moderator and to introduce both of you, and thank both of you for joining us this morning. I want to remind all of our guests that these guys both have written some pretty interesting books. I've only got a copy of Brian's because Chad's is actually a bigger hardcover book. It's too heavy for an old guy like me to carry around. Normally at one of these events, we'd allow all of our viewers who would be in person to purchase a book and get it autographed, and because then it's worth a lot more on eBay if you want to sell it. So I'm just going to make an offer to all of you that if you purchase one of their books, either Brian's Sport, Faith, and Life or Chad's Making March Madness, send us an email at business@kelvin.edu, and we'll get them to sign a book plate and send it your way. So you can have an autographed copy of their book. The question that I had is really about the trend towards greater inclusion in sports. And by inclusion, I mean just the rise of the Special Olympics movement in the last 50 years, and then the emergence of the Paralympics have really kind of brought a whole new dimension to sport. And, first of all, what do you think about that trend? And secondly, how should we all be working to make it sustainable?
Well, I'll speak into that first, Bob. That's a great question. And let me say also how appreciative I am of this opportunity. This has really been a lot of fun, and I appreciate what you guys are doing with the series. The trends toward inclusion continue to build on trends that have occurred over previous decades. And I think the prioritization of some of these sports that get us beyond just the elite level would be a really good thing for sport in general. And I'm thinking of the Special Olympics and the idea that the mission is let me win to the athlete, but if I cannot, let me be courageous in the attempt to win. And I think that gets us to a much healthier perspective on sport. Let me win, but if I cannot, let me be courageous in the attempt. The idea that we focus so much on sport, but when we get a chance to see athletes for whom just their simple participation is in itself a victory, I think that gives us a much healthier lens from which we can view sport.
And I would add, thanks for that question, Bob. I write about this some in my book. This idea, I'm a big fan of what Eunice Kennedy Shriver did with just the emergence of Special Olympics and just seeing sport as something that is beneficial for all. And so to be able to find a marginalized group in the population and say, okay, what can I do to include? And I thought that was just a fantastic effort, and it's amazing where that's gone. And so I think continuing to move in that direction and the prominence of it is just it's a fantastic, and even locally, the Special Olympics, Area 11 and everything just continues to do really good work, including that group. The Paralympics too it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with the Paralympics just because of the quality of the technology. It's amazing now what is happening with prosthetics and so on, but also the idea that not only are you getting an additional limb or being able to do different things in different ways, and I think sports might change this way, but also just the neuro activity in both directions. It's just fascinating stuff. And so the idea that people can participate in all these different ways is just it's exciting, and I think with the advances in science, we're looking at some really better opportunities for inclusion.
Awesome. Well,
Bob,
yeah, go ahead, Nancy.
Just one additional comment on this topic. We are seeing more inclusion even in college athletics. We have a young man on our track team, Simon Detmer, who has cerebral palsy, and he competed in the MIAA Indoor Championships on Saturday. And it's been really fun to watch his development. He is training for, I'm not sure what type of World Games, but you're going to see more and more of that in the college ranks as well.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you all again. And thanks again to all of our guests who tuned in today. And again, want to remind you that we're grateful for the support and the involvement of the Career Center at Kelvin, the Kelvin Alumni Association, and the Kelvin Center for Innovation and Business, who puts this series together. And we'll sure look forward to seeing all of you again next fall. And again, I made the offer, and I'm gonna keep my word on it. Feel free to send us an email at business@kelvin.edu, and we'll get you one of those autographed book plates for your copy of either one of our speakers' books. So thanks for joining us this morning. Thanks again, Nancy, for helping us out, and we'll hopefully see you all in September. Thank you.
Thank you.